The story of a Knights Templar is one most of us know, at least in broad strokes. Brave warriors clad in white mantles, marked with a simple red cross. They rode across the Holy Land with swords in hand, defending pilgrims, building fortresses, and carving out a name that would echo through centuries. They are painted in history books as monks first, soldiers second, devoted to God, yet wielding the power of kings on distant battlefields. Yet, this familiar narrative, so carefully polished, leaves shadows behind, shadows where few have dared to look. What if the true story of the Templars is not the story of men at all, but of women? Not queens in name only, not mothers of noble lineages, but unseen architects of a power so profound that history itself has tried to erase their presence? Imagine Jerusalem in the early 12th century, a city scarred by wars that have lasted decades, where the air smells of incense and blood, where pilgrims seek salvation in the streets, and courts are filled with whispers of intrigue. It is here that a small band of knights, 9 in number, pledged themselves to protect the pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land. They called themselves the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. Yet their humble title could not contain the ambitions, the wealth, and the secret influences that would follow them. This is the surface story, but beneath it runs a current that few historians have acknowledged. Beneath the cloaks of these men, behind the swords and castles, were patrons, advisors, and secret guides whose faces do not appear in the official chronicles. Women, powerful women whose roles were hidden, whose influence was profound, yet whose names were swept from the pages of history. Some were queens and countesses, their wealth funding expeditions, their counsel shaping strategy. Others were mystics, seers, or bearers of knowledge passed down through clandestine channels, often whispered in convents or hidden chambers far from the eyes of the church. They were the quiet architects, shaping alliances, moving resources, and protecting secrets that were never meant to be revealed. It is here, in this hidden network, that the Templars drew some of their deepest power, not just from their vows or their swords, but from guidance that was as ancient as it was mysterious. History remembers Hugues de Payens, the first Grand Master of the Order, but history rarely remembers the noble women who backed him. Imagine the Countesses of Champagne, arranging alliances, securing safe passage for pilgrims, and even instructing the knights in matters that might have seemed purely martial, yet were deeply strategic. These women were not passive observers. They were active participants in a web of influence that stretched from the palaces of Europe to the walls of Jerusalem. Their letters, their donations, and sometimes their subtle counsel shaped the early Templar order in ways we are only beginning to understand. Some historians call them patrons, others call them benefactors. But what if they were, in truth, the hidden hand guiding the order's destiny? And yet, these women were careful. In a world dominated by men, where power was measured by sword and title, they had to move in shadow. Their influence had to be coded in ritual, hidden in allegory, and whispered through generations. The Templars themselves, for all their secrecy, may have recognized this power. Some of the earliest Templar rules hint at respect for the feminine divine, a recognition of wisdom not bound by the cloistered halls of patriarchal authority. It is in these small, almost imperceptible nods to the hidden feminine that the first clues of a deeper story emerge. The idea is not entirely new. Scholars, occultists, and seekers of hidden histories have long speculated that the Templars were custodians of mysteries older than Christianity itself, perhaps even older than Europe's recorded history. Some suggest that their wealth, their knowledge of navigation, and their network of command were enhanced by counsel from women whose power was spiritual, political, and ancestral. These women may have been the keepers of sacred relics, the guardians of secret lineages, and the silent teachers of esoteric wisdom. They were, in a sense, queens without crowns, ruling from the shadows, shaping an order that the world remembers only as male. As we begin this journey, it is important to suspend the familiar narrative. Imagine not just the stone castles and the armored knights, but the candlelit rooms where women studied manuscripts in silence, where maps were folded in secrecy, and where discussions about strategy, prophecy, and sacred relics took place without a man ever noticing. This is the hidden world that history tried to erase, a world where women's voices carried weight not through overt authority, but through subtle influence that endured long after the banners of the Templars fell. This is the story of those hidden women, the quiet rulers of a mighty order, whose contributions were obscured by the same history that celebrated battles and bloodlines. And it is in uncovering these whispers, these traces of feminine power, that we begin to see the Templars not only as knights and monks, but as part of a larger, more complex tapestry, woven equally by the hands of men and women, by steel and shadow, by legend and secrecy. The question that drives this journey is simple, yet profound. What if the story we know is only half the truth? What if behind the white cloaks and red crosses, there was a network of women who influenced the fate of an order that would become immortal in legend? What secrets did they protect? And what truths were they forbidden to reveal? As we step into the world of the hidden women who ruled the Knights Templar, we leave the safety of the familiar and enter a world of whispers, shadows, and profound mysteries, where history and legend are inseparable, and where every stone, every manuscript, and every relic may hold a clue to a story that has waited nearly a millennium to be told. The origins of the Templars are often told as a simple story of devotion and necessity. 9 knights, bound by a vow to protect pilgrims on the road to Jerusalem, forming a humble brotherhood in the aftermath of the First Crusade. But to understand how this order could grow so rapidly, acquire such wealth, and wield influence far beyond the Holy Land, one must look not only to their courage and piety, but also to the patronage and guidance that made their rise possible. The Templars did not emerge from the desert alone. They were nurtured by the wealth and vision of women whose names rarely survive in official histories, yet whose fingerprints are indelibly marked on the early foundations of the order. Among these women, the Countess of Champagne stands as one of the earliest and most influential. Hers was not the power of the battlefield or the throne, but the power of networks, wealth, and strategic vision. In a Europe fractured by war and ambition, she understood the potential of an organization like the Templars, which could protect pilgrims, stabilize trade routes, and even act as a lever in the broader chessboard of politics. It was her endorsement, her donations, and her ability to influence the court of Jerusalem that allowed the fledgling order to flourish. Without such support, it is unlikely that 9 knights would have been able to transform themselves into one of the most powerful and mysterious organizations of the medieval world. It is striking, even now, how little is said of her. Medieval chroniclers, mostly men, were quick to record battles, feuds, and papal decrees, yet they almost entirely omitted the subtle yet profound influence of women like her. Imagine the Countess of Champagne, seated in her stone hall, surrounded by candles and parchments, poring over requests for funding, communicating secretly with the knights, arranging marriages and alliances that would secure safe passage for their missions. Each decision, though seemingly mundane, shaped the course of history, for it is through these channels that the Templars gained the political and financial support necessary to expand across Europe. Her role was not unique. Across France and the Holy Land, other noble women operated with similar discretion, nurturing the fledgling order in ways that remain invisible in conventional history. They were guardians of secrets and conveyors of wisdom, their influence a silent force moving behind the scenes. Some provided logistical support, offering safe houses and supplies. Others acted as intermediaries between courts and the order, smoothing tensions, negotiating donations, and ensuring the Templars remained aligned with the ambitions of Europe's elite. There's a subtle brilliance in this approach, power exercised not through command, but through influence and strategy. The story of the Templars cannot be separated from the broader networks of European nobility, where women often held sway in matters of marriage, inheritance, and diplomacy. In an era when direct political participation was limited, these women found other avenues to exert authority. They were patrons of art and architecture, commissioners of manuscripts, and, most crucially, enablers of the Templars' early operations. Through these seemingly ordinary acts, they were shaping an organization that would become a force across kingdoms, yet their contributions would be hidden beneath layers of myth, legend, and male-centered chronicles. Beyond the Countess of Champagne, figures like Queen Melisende of Jerusalem demonstrate a more direct connection between female leadership and Templar strategy. As queen in her own right, Melisende wielded the power of the throne, yet she also understood the spiritual and symbolic significance of the Templars' mission. She recognized that these knights were not merely soldiers. They were the embodiment of a holy mandate, yet they required guidance and oversight. Her support was both political and strategic, offering the Templars legitimacy and protection in the volatile landscape of the Crusader states. It is possible that the Templars' loyalty to the crown of Jerusalem was as much about survival as it was about spiritual devotion, and it was women like Melisende who provided the connective tissue that ensured the order could function effectively in a complex political environment. Even in the most mundane details of daily life, their presence is felt. Supplies, logistics, and letters. These were not simply administrative tasks. They were acts of power. The female patrons of the Templars managed finances, coordinated trade, and oversaw the movement of goods and people across hundreds of miles, often negotiating with local lords or merchants to secure safe passage for men on dangerous journeys. They were planners, tacticians, and protectors, operating in a world that denied them overt recognition. Through their hands, the Templars were able to extend far beyond Jerusalem, building fortresses, acquiring lands, and establishing networks that would endure for decades. Yet their influence was not only practical, it was spiritual and symbolic. Many of these women were steeped in the religious and mystical traditions of their time. They understood the power of relics, the significance of pilgrimage routes, and the potential of secret knowledge passed down through generations. Some were initiates in esoteric practices that were carefully concealed from the mainstream church, practices that may have informed Templar rituals and codes. In this way, the Templar strength was both earthly and otherworldly, grounded in gold and arms, yet subtly guided by the wisdom and vision of women who walked in the shadows. This is the duality at the heart of the Templar story. The world sees warriors and monks, but beneath their white mantles lies a network of influence that is largely feminine. Wealth, guidance, mystical insight. These were the pillars that allowed 9 Knights to become an order of legendary scope and influence. As we trace the Templars' journey from the streets of Jerusalem to the courts of Champagne and beyond, it becomes increasingly clear that their history is inseparable from the women who nurtured, guided, and shaped them. To understand the true origins of the Knights Templar, one must imagine a world where women, though hidden from the official record, exercised immense influence. They were strategists, financiers, mystics, and protectors, their presence invisible to the chroniclers of the age, yet essential to the very survival of the order. And it is through uncovering their stories, piecing together subtle clues from manuscripts, charters, and the faint whispers of legend, that we begin to glimpse a more complete picture, not just of the Templars, but of the hidden women who enabled them to rise. The Templars did not appear from nowhere. They were nurtured, financed, and guided. They were supported by hands that history has largely ignored. In following these threads, We are not simply retelling the story of an order of knights. We are uncovering the hidden currents of power that have shaped the course of history. Currents that flow as quietly as a candle flame in a darkened chamber, yet as enduring as stone walls built in Jerusalem 1,000 years ago. The early history of the Templars is often told as the story of men, knights sworn to protect pilgrims and defend Christendom. But beneath the surface, another story quietly unfolds, one that reveals the extraordinary influence of women who were far more than mere observers of history. These women were patrons, allies, and sometimes even spiritual guides whose contributions were essential to the survival and expansion of the order. In the shadows of European courts and the sacred halls of Jerusalem, they shaped decisions, protected secrets, and facilitated missions that would define the Templars' legacy for centuries to come. Among the most notable of these hidden figures were Queen Melisende of Jerusalem and Eleanor of Aquitaine. Melisende, ruling a volatile kingdom in the Holy Land during the early 12th century, understood both the necessity of military strength and the power of strategic alliances. She was a queen who wielded authority in her own right, and her support of the Templars went beyond mere political convenience. In many ways, she recognized that the order could serve as both a protective shield and a spiritual instrument, an organization that blended piety with pragmatism. Her influence was subtle yet decisive. By providing lands, granting charters, and fostering loyalty among local lords, she ensured the Templars could operate freely, extending their reach and consolidating their power. Eleanor of Aquitaine, known for her formidable intellect and unyielding will, also played a role, though in a different context. As a patron and political strategist in France, she understood the importance of resources and networks. She saw the Templars not simply as warriors, but as an emerging institution capable of shaping European politics. Through marriages, alliances, and strategic patronage, Eleanor and women like her became invisible architects, enabling the Templars to flourish far beyond the Holy Land. They wielded influence in a world where official power was largely reserved for men, demonstrating that authority could be exercised quietly, yet with remarkable efficacy. These women did not act alone. Across regions like Champagne, Languedoc, and Provence, noble women often managed estates, directed financial transactions, and oversaw the flow of goods and information. The Templars benefited enormously from these networks. Letters requesting funds, permissions, and supplies were not sent in vain. They were answered by women who understood the stakes and the subtle currents of influence. When a Templar knight rode into a foreign court or across dangerous terrain, it was often the planning, foresight, and resources provided by these women that allowed him to succeed. In effect, the Templars' ability to expand and endure depended as much on these unseen strategists as on the prowess of the knights themselves. Beyond practical support, many of these women carried spiritual authority. They were educated in the religious and mystical traditions of the era, familiar with scriptures, relics, and esoteric knowledge that could shape both perception and action. Some were associated with convents or abbeys, where they had access to manuscripts and sacred texts, often preserving teachings that were otherwise suppressed or forgotten. Their influence may have subtly guided Templar rituals, codes of conduct, and even their understanding of sacred relics. In a world dominated by male clerics and warriors, these women were custodians of wisdom, ensuring that the Templars' mission was informed by knowledge that went beyond mere martial or administrative skill. Even in the Templars' early charters and correspondence, faint traces of female involvement appear. Records show donations, bequests, and protective actions initiated by women, yet the language often obscures their presence. A donation might be recorded under the family name, or a grant acknowledged in passing, leaving the impression that a male relative was the benefactor. This subtle erasure is telling. It reflects the broader societal tendency to diminish female agency while still depending upon it. In many ways, The women who supported the Templars had to operate in plain sight while remaining invisible, exercising power without attracting scrutiny or envy. Their influence was strategic, almost surgical, leaving results without revealing the operator. Some historians have suggested that the influence of these women extended beyond tangible support and into the conceptual framework of the Templars themselves. The idea that the order might honor a sacred feminine principle, the subtle acknowledgement of wisdom beyond traditional masculine authority, may have been introduced through their council. While the Church and the wider male-dominated society largely ignored or suppressed such perspectives, within the Templars' inner circles, they may have quietly guided philosophy, ritual, and practice. It is conceivable that the Templars' commitment to discipline, secrecy, and spiritual devotion was not merely a product of monastic training, but also the reflection of counsel from women who understood the deeper interplay of power, faith, and strategy. The cumulative effect of these influences is striking. Imagine a Templar knight leaving a fortified Jerusalem for a mission across the desert, armed with sword and shield. Yet he is not alone. Behind him stands a web of support. Women ensuring that his journey is provisioned, that political alliances protect his passage, that spiritual guidance informs his understanding of duty and purpose. These women may have communicated through letters, messengers, or intermediaries, their guidance encrypted in language that only the order could understand. Their presence was like a hidden river, flowing quietly beneath the visible structures of the Templars' power, shaping outcomes and preserving the continuity of the order. It is worth noting that the influence of these women was not always recognized as such, even by the Templars themselves. Their contributions were woven into the fabric of the order's operations, embedded in rituals, finances, and strategic decisions, yet deliberately unacknowledged. The medieval world had little appetite for admitting that women could possess the insight, authority, or foresight to shape such an influential organization. And yet, without their intervention, it is difficult to imagine how a small band of knights could have become the powerful, far-reaching institution that fascinated and terrified Europe. As we look back, it becomes clear that the story of the Templars is incomplete without acknowledging these hidden figures. The knights were essential, yes, but they were not solitary actors. Behind every fortress built, every pilgrimage protected, every strategic alliance formed, there were women whose influence shaped the path of the order. They were the quiet architects, guiding the currents of history while remaining in the shadows, ensuring that the Templars were not only warriors but instruments of a vision that blended earthly ambition with spiritual purpose. By tracing their involvement, we gain a new perspective on the order. It is no longer sufficient to view the Templars solely as soldiers or monks. They were part of a larger, more intricate tapestry of influence and support, where women played crucial roles as patrons, protectors, and spiritual guides. Their contributions, hidden for centuries, invite us to reconsider the conventional narrative, revealing a Templar world that was far more complex, nuanced, and secretly empowered than history has often acknowledged. In this light, the Templars emerge not merely as an army of men, but as an organization shaped equally by those who operated behind the scenes. Women were not peripheral, they were foundational. The order's growth, its resilience, and its extraordinary reach can only be fully understood when we account for their contributions. To explore the Templars' history is, therefore, to explore the hidden power of these women, to follow the subtle currents of influence that were never meant to be documented, and to begin seeing a story that was deliberately hidden from the annals of mainstream history. Amid the bloodied sands of the Crusader kingdoms and the stone walls of early Templar fortresses, there exists a quieter, more subtle current of power, one not defined by swords, banners, or battle formations, but by devotion, secrecy, and an enigmatic reverence for the sacred feminine. Central to this current is Mary Magdalene, a figure whose image has been distorted, simplified, and often maligned by centuries of orthodox interpretation. In mainstream history, she is remembered primarily as a repentant sinner, a follower of Christ who witnessed his crucifixion and resurrection. Yet, within the hidden narratives that intersect with the Templar Order, Mary Magdalene emerges not as a marginal figure, but as a symbol of spiritual authority, an archetype of wisdom, and, according to some esoteric traditions, a bearer of a sacred lineage that the order was charged with protecting. The connection between Mary Magdalene and the Templars is subtle, elusive, and often deliberately obscured. In the rituals, symbolism, and clandestine writings attributed to the order, one finds traces of a reverence that seems out of place in a strictly male monastic military institution. Scholars and mystics alike have long speculated that the Templars' initiation ceremonies, their codes, and even the orientation of certain chapels and churches hint at a recognition of the feminine divine. Mary Magdalene, in this hidden context, is not simply a saint to be venerated, but a figure whose wisdom and spiritual authority were acknowledged, if quietly, by those who walk the line between the temporal and the eternal. Consider, for a moment, the landscape of southern France and the Languedoc region during the 12th and 13th centuries. Here, the Cathars held beliefs that were considered heretical by the Roman Church, emphasizing dualism, reincarnation, and a profound respect for the divine feminine. These ideas were dangerous to Orthodox authorities, yet they persisted, passed down in secret circles, often through women who acted as teachers, initiates, and guardians of sacred knowledge. It is within this cultural and spiritual milieu that the Templars may have encountered teachings about Mary Magdalene not as a sinner, but as a vessel of sacred wisdom, a guide to understanding divine balance and the hidden currents of the cosmos. In Templar symbolism, one can detect the faint traces of this influence. Certain manuscripts, seals, and architectural motifs suggest an acknowledgement of a principle beyond the masculine framework of knightly discipline and papal authority. Some researchers have pointed to depictions of female figures, subtle geometric patterns, or cryptic inscriptions as evidence that the Templars were not only aware of Mary Magdalene's spiritual significance, but may have incorporated her teachings into their understanding of divine law and cosmic order. The suggestion is profound, that the order, while outwardly devoted to God and church, simultaneously preserved a secret recognition of a sacred feminine, honoring a wisdom tradition that was older, more subversive, and far more nuanced than mainstream theology would allow. The significance of Mary Magdalene in this context extends beyond philosophy into the realm of lineage and guardianship. According to certain esoteric traditions, she may have carried a bloodline or spiritual legacy deemed too dangerous or important for the Church to acknowledge openly. Some believe that the Templars were entrusted with protecting this legacy, safeguarding relics, documents, or knowledge that connected Mary Magdalene to Christ in ways that would challenge the patriarchal structures of ecclesiastical authority. If these theories hold even a trace of truth, it reframes the Templars not merely as warriors of the Holy Land, but as custodians of a secret heritage, a lineage that entwined the sacred feminine with the very foundation of their mission. This hidden veneration may also help explain the respect the Templars reportedly held for women who were otherwise overlooked by history. Their interactions with noble women, patrons, and mystics were not simply transactional. They were informed by an understanding that the feminine could embody spiritual insight, strategic acumen, and the preservation of sacred knowledge. These women may have acted as intermediaries or guardians of wisdom connected to Mary Magdalene, serving as channels through which the order accessed guidance that was both practical and mystical. In this light, the Templars' relationship with influential women becomes not just a matter of convenience or politics, but an acknowledgement of a deeper, esoteric network, a web of feminine power guiding their actions and decisions. The notion of Magdalene as the Lady of Light or the keeper of a hidden wisdom challenges conventional interpretations of Christian doctrine. And yet it is precisely this tension between orthodoxy and secrecy that imbues the Templar story with its enduring fascination. While outwardly obedient to the Church, the order may have been engaged in preserving knowledge that the Church considered dangerous, heretical, or subversive. Their devotion to Mary Magdalene would have been encoded, encrypted, and hidden from the prying eyes of inquisitors and chroniclers. Seals, emblems, and initiation rituals could have served as silent testimony to this secret reverence, leaving a trail of clues for those attuned to the symbolism and willing to read between the lines of history. Artifacts and architectural choices further reinforce this connection. Certain Templar chapels, positioned with precise alignments or adorned with subtle depictions of feminine figures, suggest that these were not merely decorative elements, but intentional markers of reverence. Manuscripts surviving in obscure monasteries hint at teachings that emphasize balance, intuition, and divine wisdom, qualities traditionally associated with the feminine and esoteric thought. In a culture that prioritized male authority, these encoded symbols and teachings acted as a form of resistance, a way to preserve knowledge that could not be openly discussed. The women who influenced the Templars, whether as patrons, spiritual guides, or initiates themselves, were crucial to maintaining this delicate balance, ensuring that the sacred feminine remained present in an otherwise male-dominated institution. Perhaps the most striking implication of this hidden connection is the way it reframes the understanding of the Templars' mission. They were not only protectors of pilgrims or warriors of faith. They may have been guardians of wisdom and custodians of a spiritual legacy intertwined with Mary Magdalene. Their power and influence extended beyond temporal concerns, reaching into the mystical and the esoteric, guided by the subtle but persistent presence of women who recognize the importance of preserving knowledge that could alter the understanding of history, spirituality, and human potential. In this light, the Knights Templar emerge as far more complex than the outward appearance of cloaks, crosses, and castles suggests. They were part of a hidden world where spiritual insight, strategic guidance, and the protection of sacred knowledge converged. Mary Magdalene, long misrepresented and obscured by history, becomes a symbol of this hidden current, a figure whose wisdom, lineage, and spiritual authority flowed quietly through the order, shaping their actions and their destiny. The women connected to the Templars, whether noble patrons or secret initiates, were the channels through which this influence was preserved and transmitted, ensuring that the sacred feminine remained a guiding force, even as the broader world remained unaware. To trace the Templars' path without acknowledging this influence is to read only half the story. Their campaigns, fortresses, and rituals were supported not just by wealth and strategy, but by the quiet, enduring power of women who understood the significance of Mary Magdalene and the wisdom she represented. They ensured that the order's mission was grounded not only in devotion and discipline, but in awareness of a sacred legacy that had to be protected, concealed, and ultimately remembered. In exploring this hidden connection, we begin to see the Templars in a new light, not just as men in white cloaks, but as part of a tapestry of influence, faith, and secrecy, woven equally by the hands of those who were visible and those who worked in the shadows. In the sun-washed valleys of Languedoc, amidst vineyards, rolling hills, and ancient stone villages, a different kind of spiritual current flowed, one that the Church would later deem heretical, yet which profoundly shaped the hidden networks of power that intersected with the Templars. The Cathars, or the Pure Ones as they called themselves, believed in a dualistic universe, where the material world was a shadow, a prison of darkness, and the soul sought return to a higher, spiritual realm. Within this belief system, the divine feminine was not only acknowledged, but revered. Women were not secondary participants. They were spiritual leaders, teachers, and, in some cases, the very embodiment of sacred knowledge. Known as perfecti, these women were revered for their wisdom, their ability to guide souls, and their intimate understanding of divine truth. It is within this context that the Templars' path intersects with the Cathars in ways that are often overlooked. While knights were engaged in battles to secure holy sites and protect pilgrims, a quieter war was being waged in the realm of ideas and spiritual authority. The Cathars' insistence on the sacred feminine, their teachings of spiritual equality, and their commitment to preserving knowledge threatened the rigid hierarchy of the Catholic Church. Women, in particular, wielded influence that rivaled any nobleman or knight. Their spiritual authority extended to guiding communities, preserving sacred texts, and mentoring initiates in rituals that combine philosophy, meditation, and mystical practice. It is likely that the Templars, who valued both secrecy and divine wisdom, recognized the significance of these teachings, even if public acknowledgement was impossible. The persecution of the Cathars, culminating in the Albigensian Crusade, reveals the Church's fear not merely of heresy, but of the feminine power embedded within these communities. Entire towns were destroyed, leaders executed, and women who held spiritual authority were silenced. Yet the memory of their teachings, the rituals they performed, and the networks they established did not vanish entirely. Some historians speculate that the Templars, with their vast network and penchant for secrecy, became inadvertent custodians of this hidden knowledge. The women who survived or operated in exile may have served as intermediaries, preserving wisdom that was then integrated into the esoteric practices of the order. These women, often invisible in the chronicles of war and conquest, acted as conduits of a spiritual lineage that traced back to Mary Magdalene and the sacred feminine. Their role was not merely symbolic. Through teaching, mentorship, and guidance, they influenced the very formation of the Templar ethos, infusing it with principles of balance, insight, and moral discernment that extended beyond martial skill. Imagine a hidden chamber in a Languedoc abbey, where candlelight flickers against walls lined with manuscripts and sacred symbols, and where a woman speaks in hushed tones of divine mysteries to a small circle of initiates. It is here, in these clandestine spaces, that the Templar philosophy may have absorbed the echoes of Cathar wisdom. The connection between the Cathars and the Templars is further suggested by the overlap of geography, timing, and social networks. Many noble families in southern France had ties to both movements, providing safe houses, resources, and political protection. Women within these families often acted as the linchpins, managing correspondence, distributing funds, and ensuring that knowledge could be transmitted discreetly. Their actions were subtle, often recorded in coded language or preserved in symbolic gestures that only those within the network could interpret. Through these channels, the Templars were able to access ideas and practices that were considered dangerous or forbidden, embedding them within an otherwise orthodox military religious framework. The spiritual training of women in Cathar communities also highlights their role as keepers of esoteric wisdom. Unlike the male-dominated clerical hierarchy, which emphasized doctrine and obedience, the perfecti emphasized direct experience of the divine, moral rigor, and personal responsibility. They trained others in meditation, interpretation of sacred texts, and the transmission of knowledge through oral and symbolic methods. These skills would have been invaluable to the Templars, whose own secretive rituals and codes relied on understanding hidden meanings, maintaining secrecy, and navigating complex social and political terrains. Women, therefore, were not merely supporters of the order. They were intellectual and spiritual partners in a broader enterprise of hidden knowledge. Even the symbols and architecture associated with southern France bear traces of this influence. Some scholars have pointed to motifs in Cathar-influenced chapels and manuscripts, geometric patterns, dualistic imagery, and depictions of feminine figures as evidence of a shared esoteric vocabulary. These symbols may have served as a silent language, enabling those within the Templar network to communicate ideas, allegiances, or spiritual principles without drawing the attention of the church or political authorities. In this sense, the Templars' respect for secrecy, their esoteric rituals, and their coded inscriptions may owe as much to the lessons of Cathar women as to the monastic traditions of the order itself. The persistence of these teachings, despite persecution, demonstrates the resilience of women's influence. While male leaders were often executed, imprisoned, or forced into exile, women preserved knowledge through subtle means. Hidden manuscripts, secret gatherings, and networks of trust that spanned cities, castles, and abbeys. Their vigilance ensured that the wisdom of the Cathars, intertwined with the sacred feminine, continued to circulate quietly, waiting for a generation capable of integrating it into other movements. The Templars, with their extensive reach, discretion, and resources, were ideally positioned to serve as intermediaries in this transmission, bridging the ancient traditions of the divine feminine with the emerging order's mission. It is here, in the quiet corridors of southern France, that one can glimpse the intersection of mystery and history. The Templars were not operating in isolation. They were part of a network of influence that included women who were spiritual authorities, scholars, and custodians of forbidden knowledge. The Cathars' reverence for the feminine divine, their emphasis on wisdom over rank, and their dedication to preserving truth under threat of annihilation created conditions in which Templar and female influence could converge. Together, these forces helped shape an order that was both practical and mystical, martial and spiritual, visible to the world yet deeply hidden in purpose. Ultimately, the story of the Cathar women and their connection to the Templars is a story of resilience, intelligence, and subtle power. These women navigated a perilous landscape, preserving knowledge that was deemed dangerous, teaching principles that would outlast the violent suppression of their communities, and guiding the Templars in ways that history has only begun to acknowledge. Their influence was invisible to chroniclers, yet it was profound, shaping the moral, spiritual, and strategic foundation of an order that would endure long after the Crusader castles crumbled and the armies dispersed. Through understanding their role, we begin to see that the Templars' power was not solely derived from swords or papal sanction. It was cultivated in the hidden rooms of abbeys, in whispered instructions from women who understood both the material and spiritual dimensions of influence, and in the careful transmission of sacred knowledge that could survive centuries of persecution. The Cathar women were the hidden flame, and the Templars, knowingly or not, carried that flame across Europe, embedding it into the very structure of an order whose history is far more complex than the battles and crusades suggest. As the Templar order grew in both size and influence, whispers began to circulate about a deeper, more hidden layer of their organization, one that was rarely acknowledged, even within the order itself. While the Knights are remembered for their white cloaks, their red crosses, and their military prowess, there are persistent traces suggesting the existence of a hidden sisterhood. Women who are not passive observers, nor simply patrons or benefactors, but active participants in the shaping of the Templars' spiritual, strategic, and esoteric identity. These women were part of a clandestine network, an invisible force operating alongside the Knights, guiding the order in ways that history has deliberately left unrecorded. The very idea of a female branch within the Templars seems, at first, almost impossible. The order was famously monastic and male, with strict rules governing the behavior of its members. Yet, the evidence of women's involvement, though scattered and fragmentary, appears in multiple forms. References in obscure manuscripts, coded language in Templar seals, architectural anomalies in certain chapels, and oral traditions passed down in secret. Chroniclers, who were overwhelmingly male and often aligned with ecclesiastical authorities, rarely recorded these women, but their influence cannot be entirely erased. They were the hidden architects, the unseen strategists, the silent keepers of knowledge that was considered too dangerous or powerful for general disclosure. Legends speak of groups with evocative names: the Sisters of the Temple, the Order of the Dove, or the Ladies of the Grail. While the historical accuracy of these titles is debated, their persistence in folklore suggests a cultural memory of women who operated in tandem with the Templars. These women were more than symbolic figures. They were educated, connected, and in some cases, initiates in spiritual practices that were deliberately concealed from a church. In regions such as Languedoc and Provence, noble women and mystics alike played roles that extended beyond finance and diplomacy. They may have instructed knights in mystical traditions, preserved sacred texts, and advised on the handling of relics or the interpretation of cryptic symbols. Their contributions were subtle, encoded in rituals and allegories that only the initiated could fully comprehend. Some of the most compelling evidence for a hidden sisterhood comes from the very spaces the Templars occupied. In certain chapels and commanderies, researchers have identified carvings, frescoes, and spatial arrangements that suggest a feminine presence or veneration. Female figures appear alongside knights in unexpected ways, sometimes positioned in places of symbolic prominence. Certain ritual chambers, accessible only to a select few, contain patterns or inscriptions that defy conventional interpretation. While these elements could be coincidental, when considered alongside the records of women's patronage, spiritual influence, and esoteric knowledge, a pattern emerges. The Templars were not operating solely as a male order. There was a parallel, hidden stream of feminine influence that guided their decisions and safeguarded secrets. These women, unlike the knights, had to operate with extreme discretion. Their authority could not be openly declared. Their influence had to be exercised in ways that would avoid drawing suspicion or attracting persecution. Some acted under the guise of noble patrons, others as abbesses or spiritual advisors. They provided financial resources, arranged political alliances, and offered guidance on matters of sacred significance. In some cases, their presence was likely encoded within Templar rituals. Initiation ceremonies, oaths, and symbolic gestures may have been influenced by feminine principles of balance, intuition, and insight. The Templars, outwardly a male monastic military order, may have been drawing on this hidden wisdom without acknowledging it publicly. The role of these women also extended into the protection and transmission of esoteric knowledge. Manuscripts hint at teachings that combined Christian symbolism with older, Gnostic ideas, including a reverence for Mary Magdalene and the sacred feminine. The women who were part of the hidden Templar network may have acted as custodians of this knowledge, preserving texts, instructing initiates, and ensuring that sacred relics and teachings survive the scrutiny of both secular and ecclesiastical authorities. Their work required patience, intelligence, and a profound understanding of secrecy. In a world that punished deviation from orthodoxy with imprisonment or death, they were the quiet guardians of a legacy that could not risk exposure. The concept of the Grail, so intimately tied to the Templars and legend, may have been connected to this hidden sisterhood. While mainstream interpretations often cast the Grail as a physical chalice or treasure, esoteric traditions suggest it represented spiritual wisdom, divine bloodlines, or sacred knowledge. Women within the Templar network may have been the original custodians of this wisdom, guiding its preservation and dissemination through coded symbols, rituals, and oral instruction. The knights, as visible actors, were entrusted with protecting the order and its outward reputation, while the women managed the subtler, internal currents, ensuring continuity, interpreting meaning, and maintaining the spiritual integrity of the organization. Geography also played a role in this secrecy. In southern France, near the Pyrenees and along the winding roads of Languedoc, the hidden sisterhood could operate in a landscape filled with remote abbeys, hidden valleys, and castles where secrecy was easier to maintain. Noble estates, often under the management of women, became safe houses and centers for teaching and strategy. Here, manuscripts were copied, relics safeguarded, and spiritual instruction imparted. In these secluded spaces, women could preserve knowledge without interference from inquisitors, bishops, or even the knights themselves. They were the lifeblood of an invisible order, moving quietly yet decisively across the map of medieval Europe. It is also significant that these women may have acted as intermediaries between disparate networks of power. They connected noble patrons, mystics, spiritual initiates, and the Templar Knights themselves, creating a web of influence that was both resilient and adaptable. Their strategic and spiritual guidance was subtle but effective, enabling the Templars to navigate political upheavals, religious scrutiny, and military campaigns. In many ways, the success and endurance of the order were inseparable from the contributions of these women, even if their names were never written in the official chronicles. Legends of the hidden sisterhood endured long after the formal dissolution of the Templar order in the early 14th century. Some stories suggest that these women survived, continued their work in secrecy, and influenced later esoteric orders and mystical traditions. While much of this is speculation, the persistence of these narratives, combined with the fragmented historical evidence, points to a profound truth. The Templars' power was never entirely male. There was a hidden stream, a secret lineage of women whose wisdom, spiritual insight, and strategic acumen shaped the order in ways that the world is only beginning to recognize. In exploring this hidden sisterhood, we're compelled to reconsider what we think we know about the Templars. They were not merely warriors or monks. They were part of a larger, more intricate tapestry of influence, one in which women played central, indispensable roles. Their contributions were subtle, encoded in ritual, preserved in secrecy, and transmitted through a combination of spiritual guidance and strategic action. By acknowledging the hidden sisterhood, we uncover a dimension of the Templars' history that challenges conventional narratives and invites us to see the order not just as an instrument of male authority, but as a complex institution shaped by the interplay of visible and invisible forces, masculine and feminine, worldly and sacred. Along the rugged coasts of western France, in the bustling port town of La Rochelle, whispers of the Templars take on a distinctly maritime tone. It is a place where ships' masts creak in the wind, gulls cry above bustling harbors, and the salty spray of the Atlantic mixes with secrets long buried beneath the cobblestones. La Rochelle became a crucial hub for the Templar fleet, the silent arm of an order often imagined as solely knights on horseback or defenders of pilgrim caravans. Here, in these busy docks and hidden coves, a different story emerges, one in which women played a crucial, often overlooked role in maintaining, directing, and some say even commanding parts of the order's naval operations. The notion of women involved in a military religious fleet may seem implausible at first, yet the evidence of patronage, secret correspondence, and family ties suggests otherwise. Many of the noble women who supported the Templars held estates near ports or controlled maritime resources, granting them influence over trade, supply routes, and naval logistics. They arranged for safe passage, managed cargoes, and even mediated political disputes that could threaten Templar operations. In essence, they acted as the unseen captains and quartermasters of a fleet that operated across the Mediterranean and Atlantic, providing the order with mobility, intelligence, and strategic advantage that few historians have fully acknowledged. Local legends in La Rochelle speak of women in black cloaks, moving through the foggy streets at night, carrying parcels of correspondence or sacred artifacts to waiting ships. These stories, though romanticized over centuries, may contain kernels of truth. They suggest that women were trusted to transport critical information and objects, acting as intermediaries between the Templar commanderies on land and their fleet at sea. In a world where secrecy was paramount, the order could afford no mistakes. Every movement of ships, every delivery of supplies, had to be carefully orchestrated. The involvement of women, who were less likely to attract suspicion and whose authority was subtle yet effective, was an essential part of this operation. The Templar fleet itself was extraordinary for its time, capable of transporting knights, horses, supplies, and sacred relics. It extended the order's influence far beyond Europe's shores. While contemporary accounts focus on the skill of the sailors and the bravery of the knights, few mention the logistical genius required to maintain such a force. Women, particularly those with wealth and estates tied to maritime trade, provided funding, arranged ports of call, and ensured the fleet's secret operations remained invisible to prying eyes. In effect, they acted as strategic planners, combining knowledge of commerce, politics, and naval technology to support the order's reach across the Mediterranean, Atlantic, and even into northern Europe. Some scholars have suggested that the Templar fleet may have been a conduit for esoteric knowledge, sacred relics, and documents too sensitive to remain on land. Certain manuscripts hint at secret cargoes moving under cover of night, accompanied by trusted emissaries whose identities were carefully protected. Women, acting as guardians, were ideally suited to this task. Their participation was invisible in official records, yet indispensable to the success of these operations. It is conceivable that the fleet's ability to evade detection, outmaneuver rivals, and transport treasures safely was due, in large part, to the strategic and spiritual guidance provided by these hidden figures. The presence of women in maritime networks also reflects a broader pattern in the Templar Order. Wherever secrecy, strategy, or sacred knowledge was at stake, women appeared as essential facilitators. In La Rochelle, as the fleet prepared for long voyages, women coordinated the flow of information between inland commanderies and distant harbors. They monitored political developments, advised on alliances, and ensured that resources were in place to support both knights and the sacred missions entrusted to the order. This dual role, practical and spiritual, mundane and mystical, allowed the Templars to operate effectively in a world rife with danger, intrigue, and competing interests. Stories passed down through the centuries also hint at an almost ritualistic dimension to these women's maritime involvement. Some legends speak of ceremonies performed before a fleet set sail, candles lit, sacred texts consulted, and blessings invoked, often by women whose presence ensured the protection of both the ships and the sacred cargoes they carried. These rituals, part practical and part symbolic, reinforced the Templars' commitment to secrecy, discipline, and divine favor. It is in these moments that the Order's respect for the feminine, its acknowledgement of wisdom, intuition, and spiritual authority, becomes most apparent. Women were not merely participants. They were integral to the Templars' ability to navigate both the physical seas and the spiritual currents that guided the Order. La Rochelle also serves as a geographic and symbolic threshold, the place where the Templars' visible power, castles, knights, and banners, meets their hidden influence, the unseen network of women who safeguarded knowledge, wealth, and strategy. The port represents movement, transition, and secrecy. Ships could carry more than soldiers. They could transport ideas, relics, and the encoded wisdom of a hidden sisterhood. In this way, La Rochelle becomes more than a historical location. It becomes a narrative space where the visible and invisible intersect, where history and legend merge, and where the role of women in the Templars' operations comes into sharp relief. Through these lenses, the Templar fleet is not just a logistical achievement, but a testament to the Order's reliance on hidden networks of influence, many of which were led or maintained by women. Their involvement in maritime operations illustrates a recurring theme in the Templar story: the blending of worldly and spiritual, male and female, visible and hidden. The women of La Rochelle, whether through direct command, patronage, or ritual participation, ensured that the order could extend its reach, protect its secrets, and preserve the sacred legacy entrusted to it. In doing so, they challenge our conventional understanding of the Templars, revealing that behind every ship and banner, there was a hidden hand guiding the course of history. Within the stone walls of Templar commanderies and the quiet shadows of their chapels, there existed a world few outsiders ever glimpsed. The knights, sworn to piety and discipline, followed strict rules of conduct, yet their outward rituals, daily prayers, inspections, and military formations, were only the surface of something far deeper. Beneath these visible practices lay initiation ceremonies and secret rites, coded in symbols and allegories, designed to bind members not only to the order, but to its hidden knowledge. These were not merely tests of courage or obedience. They were gateways into a spiritual and esoteric universe, a universe in which the feminine played a subtle but indispensable role. The initiation into the Templar Order was shrouded in mystery, described in later accounts with a mix of fascination and fear. Candidates were brought into dimly lit chambers, walls lined with sacred symbols, their senses heightened by the flickering light of candles. Oaths were sworn, hands were placed upon sacred texts, and the initiates were subjected to symbolic trials that tested their loyalty, courage, and understanding of hidden truths. Yet within these rites, there were signs of a recognition that power and wisdom were not solely masculine. Certain symbols, often circular, representing cycles, completion, or feminine balance, appeared repeatedly, hinting at principles that may have been taught or guided by women who understood the esoteric currents of the order. Women's influence in these rituals was subtle, encoded in ways that could escape a casual observer but carried profound significance for those attuned to the hidden meanings. Some acted as advisors or ritual overseers, ensuring that the initiates comprehended not only the letter of their oaths, but the spiritual essence beneath them. Others may have been responsible for safeguarding sacred texts and relics used in the ceremonies, guiding the symbolic narrative of life, death, and rebirth that formed the spiritual backbone of the Templar initiation. In essence, the presence of women ensured that the rites were not purely militaristic or patriarchal, but imbued with a balance that honored both masculine and feminine principles. The symbolism of the sacred feminine is particularly evident in certain initiation motifs that recur across Templar documents and architectural spaces. Circles, spirals, and dualistic imagery appear alongside crosses, swords, and shields, creating a complex visual language that communicates spiritual truths, moral responsibilities, and ethical codes. While knights performed the visible acts of devotion, women, acting behind the scenes, may have ensured that these rituals conveyed lessons about intuition, discernment, and the invisible threads connecting all actions to a higher purpose. In this way, the hidden female presence was not ornamental. It was formative, shaping the spiritual education of each new member. Some historians and esoteric researchers suggest that the Templars' secret rituals were influenced by older, Gnostic traditions, which emphasized the sacred feminine as essential to spiritual enlightenment. The Order's coded language, their use of relics, and their careful preservation of knowledge may have been informed by women who carried these ancient teachings. These women, often part of noble families or religious networks, acted as transmitters of wisdom that could not be openly shared in a church-dominated society. Their influence ensured that the Templars' spiritual education extended beyond obedience to rules or battlefield discipline, encompassing a deeper understanding of divine balance, cosmic law, and the moral consequences of action. The presence of women in Templar ceremonies also reinforced the notion that power and insight could operate quietly, subtly, yet with immense effect. While the knights were the visible force, the muscle and authority of the order, the women acted as the guiding intelligence, shaping the spiritual and ethical framework within which the men operated. Their influence was encoded in chants, symbols, and ritual sequences, as well as in the transmission of sacred texts, relics, and even secret knowledge about sacred geography and prophecy. These contributions were invisible to outsiders, intentionally concealed, yet they formed the backbone of the Templars' inner strength. Rituals often began with symbolic gestures that evoked cycles of life, death, and renewal, reflecting principles associated with the divine feminine, patience, nurturing, and the invisible power of influence. The initiates were led through challenges that tested both body and spirit, but the lessons extended beyond obedience. They were being taught to recognize unseen forces, to act with moral discernment, and to appreciate the wisdom of those whose authority was subtle but profound. Women were central to this process, whether as custodians of ritual knowledge, interpreters of symbolism, or spiritual guides who ensured that the initiates were prepared to carry both the visible and hidden responsibilities of the order. The esoteric dimension of Templar rituals also served a practical purpose. By embedding secret knowledge within ceremonies and symbols, the order created a protective barrier against infiltration, heresy, or misuse of sacred objects. Women, often the keepers of this knowledge, ensured that the teachings could be transmitted safely across generations, maintaining continuity even in the face of persecution. Their role was not peripheral. It was strategic, moral, and spiritual. Without this hidden guidance, the Templars' ability to maintain coherence, secrecy, and integrity in a volatile medieval world would have been significantly diminished. In exploring these rituals, one begins to see the Templars not simply as a military religious order, but as an institution that blended discipline, devotion, and esoteric wisdom. The hidden influence of women ensured that the order's spiritual dimension was preserved alongside its martial prowess. They were the silent architects of moral and mystical education, shaping an organization that could operate effectively in both visible and invisible realms. Their presence reminds us that the Templars' power was not derived solely from swords, fortresses, or papal recognition, but from a careful balance of visible action and hidden guidance, a duality in which women played a central, indispensable role. Through these ceremonies, the Templars were connected to a lineage of wisdom and spiritual practice that predates the order itself. Women, whether patrons, mystics, or secret initiates, acted as custodians of this lineage, preserving teachings that integrated the sacred feminine into the order's ethos. In doing so, they ensured that the Templars were not merely an army or a monastic brotherhood, but a complex, spiritually attuned institution, capable of navigating the worlds of war, politics, and hidden knowledge with subtlety, insight, and a rare moral intelligence. Across the centuries, the Templars became synonymous with wealth, sacred relics, and mysterious treasures, objects whose significance was often as symbolic as it was material. Yet behind the gleaming chalices, intricately carved reliquaries, and carefully guarded manuscripts lay an often overlooked truth. The custodians of these treasures were frequently women. These women were not passive stewards. They were active participants in the preservation, concealment, and transmission of knowledge and artifacts that could alter the course of spiritual and temporal history. Their role was subtle but critical, bridging the visible authority of the knights and the hidden currents of sacred wisdom. In many Templar commanderies, women acted as the intermediaries between sacred relics and the wider network of the order. They oversaw the preservation of manuscripts, ensuring that knowledge, esoteric, spiritual, or practical, was protected from decay, theft, or destruction. Some of these texts contained coded instructions for rituals, symbolic maps of holy sites, or theological commentaries that challenged orthodox interpretations of Scripture. The women responsible for safeguarding them understood both their material value and their deeper significance. They were archivists, scholars, and secret guardians, often working in dimly lit chambers, cataloging, copying, and interpreting these objects in ways that would ensure the continuity of the order's hidden legacy. Artifacts themselves were often imbued with layers of symbolism that required careful understanding and interpretation. Chalices, reliquaries, and ornate crosses were not merely ceremonial. They acted as vessels of spiritual authority and keys to hidden teachings. Women, particularly those with mystical training or noble lineage, were entrusted to discern their meaning and ensure their proper use. Their guardianship was not only practical, but symbolic, reflecting the Templars' acknowledgement that wisdom and insight often resided outside the visible hierarchy. By maintaining the integrity of these relics, women preserved a connection to sacred traditions that predated the order itself, safeguarding truths that could not be exposed to the uninitiated. Some of the most famous Templar relics, whose whereabouts remain debated even today, are believed to have been directly protected by women. Manuscripts suggest that these women managed the movement of objects across Europe, ensuring that they remained hidden during times of persecution, crusade, or political upheaval. Relics might be transported under cover of night, through secret passages, or aboard discreetly funded ships. In each case, women coordinated the operation, maintaining secrecy while ensuring that the treasures reached their intended destination intact. Their meticulous planning, courage, and intelligence were vital to the survival of objects whose symbolic power could rival the influence of kings or the church itself. In some accounts, women were entrusted not only with physical artifacts, but with spiritual legacies embedded within them. A chalice might be more than gold and silver. It could carry encoded knowledge, symbolic instructions, or even clues to hidden locations of sacred significance. The female custodians acted as interpreters and teachers, ensuring that the wisdom encoded within these artifacts was understood by those initiated into the Templar mysteries. Their role required both intellectual rigor and spiritual insight, a combination rarely recorded in male-dominated chronicles, yet essential to the order's esoteric continuity. The presence of women in the management of relics also reflects a broader theme: the Templars' reliance on subtle networks of influence. Just as women guided knights in spiritual matters or arranged political alliances, they managed tangible evidence of the order's sacred mission. Without their oversight, relics could have been lost, stolen, or misinterpreted, severing the link between past knowledge and present practice. In this sense, women acted as both guardians and gatekeepers, controlling access to objects that were as much instruments of power as they were symbols of faith. Consider the journeys of sacred manuscripts, often copied and transported by women under strict secrecy. These documents, sometimes encoded with symbolic language or diagrams, were not intended for the casual reader. Only those who were instructed, guided, and trusted by the female custodians could interpret their meaning correctly. Through this careful stewardship, knowledge was transmitted across generations, often surviving centuries of war, inquisitions, and political turmoil. The invisibility of these women in written records belies their profound influence. They were the hidden librarians of the Templars, preserving the intellectual and spiritual foundation of an order whose reputation rested on both secrecy and authority. Artifacts themselves often carried embedded allegories or spiritual instructions connected to Mary Magdalene, the sacred feminine, or Cathar teachings. Women, well-versed in esoteric symbolism, interpreted these messages, ensuring that knights understood their deeper implications. Whether a relic was a simple cross, a jewel-encrusted chalice, or a manuscript, it became a tool for teaching, spiritual reflection, and strategic planning. The female custodians ensured that the sacred and symbolic functions of these objects were never lost, reinforcing the idea that the order's strength depended not only on martial prowess, but on hidden knowledge preserved and transmitted through women's guidance. The protection of relics also carried immense political and social risk. Possession of sacred objects, especially those rumored to carry secret or heretical knowledge, could provoke persecution, arrest, or execution. Women who undertook this responsibility did so at great personal risk, yet they understood the stakes and acted with unwavering commitment. In managing these artifacts, they exercised intelligence, diplomacy, and courage that rivaled any knight in battle. Their contribution to the order was not visible on the battlefield, but was equally decisive in ensuring that the Templars' mission, both sacred and secret, endured. Ultimately, the artifacts, relics, and sacred texts of the Templars cannot be fully understood without recognizing the women who safeguarded them. These objects were not simply treasures or curiosities. They were vessels of knowledge, symbols of power, and tools for preserving spiritual wisdom. Women ensured that these items survived, that their meaning remained intact, and that their sacred purpose continued to guide the order. In doing so, they revealed a truth often hidden in history, that the Templars' greatest treasures were not swords or castles, but the knowledge, insight, and spiritual authority preserved and transmitted by women working in the shadows. Within the vast network of the Templars, secrecy was not simply a practice. It was a lifeblood. The Order's operations spanned continents. Its influence touched courts and cities, and yet its most potent power lay in the knowledge that was deliberately concealed. Codes, symbols, and maps formed an intricate web that only the initiated could decipher. Among the most remarkable aspects of this hidden knowledge was the crucial role women played in its creation, interpretation, and preservation. They were not mere scribes or record keepers. They were strategists and cryptographers, entrusted with information that could safeguard the order or, if exposed, imperil its very existence. Templar codes were multifaceted, blending alphanumeric ciphers, symbolic illustrations, and visual allegories. Manuscripts contained sequences of numbers and letters whose meanings were accessible only to those trained in their subtleties. Some documents include geometric patterns and abstract designs, which could represent spiritual principles, instruction for the handling of sacred relics, or maps of secret locations. Women within the network often acted as the intermediaries and interpreters of these codes. Their literacy, education, and discretion made them ideal for safeguarding the transmission of messages, ensuring that crucial knowledge remained inaccessible to outsiders, yet fully comprehensible to those initiated into the Order's inner circles. Maps provide another layer of this hidden intelligence. While historical records acknowledge the Templars' strategic command of fortresses and maritime routes, there are hints of maps far more sophisticated than anything publicly documented at the time. Some researchers suggest that these maps included encoded references to sacred sites, buried treasures, or routes designed to evade detection by hostile forces. Women often oversaw the creation, copying, and safeguarding of these documents. Their role was critical. A misread map or lost codex could expose the Order to political intrigue or military attack. By controlling access to these secret instruments, women acted as both protectors and educators, ensuring that the knowledge they contained was preserved and understood by the right individuals. The use of hidden messages extended beyond paper and ink. Templar seals, architectural features, and even ceremonial rituals encoded information in ways that were subtle but precise. Circular carvings, spirals, and repeated symbols were not ornamental. They carried meaning that could only be decoded by those trained to read the language of secrecy. Women were frequently responsible for guiding knights in the interpretation of these symbols. Their knowledge of esoteric systems, coupled with an understanding of geography, theology, and spiritual philosophy, allowed them to serve as custodians of an intelligence network that was both practical and mystical. The significance of these hidden messages becomes even more apparent when considering the Templars' role in safeguarding sacred relics, financial assets, and spiritual teachings. Ciphers and coded documents ensured that locations, instructions, and ceremonial practices could be communicated without risk of interception. Women, trusted with this knowledge, managed the flow of information across regions, often coordinating between distant commanderies and the Order's maritime operations. Their discretion and competence allowed the Templars to operate with remarkable agility, even in the face of political upheaval, religious persecution, or the threat of espionage. Some researchers have speculated that the Templars' coded messages were also spiritual in nature, designed to transmit esoteric wisdom alongside practical instructions. Symbols connected to the sacred feminine, Mary Magdalene, or Cathar philosophy appear in manuscripts, carvings, and seals. Women, familiar with these traditions, could interpret, contextualize, and transmit the meaning embedded in these codes. In doing so, they ensured that the Order's members were not only strategically competent, but also spiritually and philosophically aligned with the principles guiding their mission. This dual function, practical and mystical, highlights the indispensable role of women in maintaining the Templars' secret knowledge. Beyond interpretation, women were often responsible for maintaining the integrity of the network itself. They managed the training of new initiates, ensuring that knowledge of codes and maps was passed down carefully and securely. This required both intellectual skill and moral discernment, as improper access could compromise the Order. In essence, women acted as the guardians of continuity, preserving the Order's most sensitive knowledge while adapting it to new generations. Their contribution was invisible to the public, rarely recorded in chronicles, yet vital to the Templars' survival and effectiveness. The interplay of secrecy, strategy, and spiritual symbolism also highlights the unique perspective women brought to the Order. While knights focused on battle, defense, and visible authority, women cultivated the intellectual and mystical dimensions of Templar power. By interpreting codes, safeguarding maps, and transmitting hidden knowledge, they ensured that the Order remained not only militarily formidable, but intellectually sophisticated and spiritually grounded. The result was an organization that could operate simultaneously in public and private, secular and sacred, visible and hidden, an equilibrium that relied on the quiet, indispensable guidance of women. Finally, the legacy of these women extends far beyond the dissolution of the Order in 1312. Even as the Templars were officially disbanded, the knowledge they preserved, the codes they created, and the secrets they safeguarded may have been transmitted through hidden networks, influencing later mystical societies, esoteric orders, and clandestine traditions. Their work ensured that the Templars' wisdom, while suppressed or obscured, survived in fragments, encoded in texts, symbols, and oral traditions, waiting for those capable of deciphering it. In this sense, women were the living memory of the Order, ensuring that its secrets would endure far longer than any stone fortress or battlefield victory. Through their stewardship of codes, maps, and hidden messages, women reveal themselves as far more than supporting actors in the Templar story. They were strategists, scholars, and guardians of a knowledge that was as dangerous as it was valuable. By controlling the flow of information and maintaining the integrity of the Order's secret network, they shaped the course of history, often invisibly, yet with profound effect. The Templars' extraordinary achievements, military, spiritual, and esoteric, cannot be fully understood without recognizing the women who worked tirelessly behind the scenes, interpreting, preserving, and transmitting the Order's most guarded secrets. The year 1307 marks one of the most dramatic and devastating chapters in Templar history, when the wheels of persecution turned inexorably against the Order. King Philip IV of France, deeply in debt to the Templars and hungry for their wealth, orchestrated a coordinated attack on the Order, accusing its members of heresy, blasphemy, and immoral practices. Across France, knights were arrested in the dead of night. Castles and commanderies were seized, and the machinery of suppression moved with terrifying efficiency. Yet amid this sweeping crackdown, a less visible story unfolded. The targeting, surveillance, and displacement of women connected to the Templars, noble patrons, spiritual guides, and custodians of sacred knowledge, whose roles were crucial to the order's inner workings. Unlike the knights, these women were rarely formally accused or executed, largely because their influence was indirect and invisible to the legal apparatus of the time. Their power operated in shadows, through networks of communication, stewardship of relics, and the transmission of esoteric knowledge. Philip's agents, focused on tangible assets and military might, often overlooked the women, which paradoxically allowed many of them to survive the purges. Yet survival came with peril. Properties were confiscated, alliances were disrupted, and the very networks that enabled their influence had to be re-established under strict secrecy. In effect, the persecution forced these women to adapt, preserve, and relocate their knowledge in ways that would ensure the order's spiritual and esoteric legacies endured. The trials of Templar Knights provide a chilling backdrop to this story. Under torture, some revealed aspects of the order's practices, though the truth was often distorted, exaggerated, or fabricated by inquisitors eager to justify their actions. While male knights bore the immediate brunt of imprisonment and execution, women's involvement was both more subtle and more enduring. They had to navigate the aftermath, protecting sacred texts, guiding surviving initiates, and maintaining the integrity of esoteric rituals, often under the constant threat of suspicion. Their work became a delicate balancing act, preserving knowledge without attracting attention, maintaining networks without leaving traceable evidence, and sustaining the spiritual continuity of an order that had been publicly annihilated. This period also highlights the resilience and ingenuity of the women connected to the Templars. Noble families, particularly those in regions like Languedoc and Provence, provided safe havens for displaced Templar assets, documents, and even surviving knights. Women acted as intermediaries, transporting manuscripts, relics, and coded messages across Europe, often using discreet maritime routes, secret passages, or disguised caravans. In doing so, they preserved the operational and spiritual frameworks of the order, ensuring that the essence of Templar knowledge could survive despite the loss of visible structures and public recognition. The survival of hidden networks required exceptional skill in secrecy and discretion. Women coordinated with sympathetic clergy, merchants, and local lords, maintaining lines of communication that connected the remnants of the order across borders. This clandestine infrastructure was vital for the preservation of esoteric teachings, including the knowledge of sacred relics, initiation rites, and coded manuscripts. By operating under the radar, these women ensured that the Templar's spiritual and intellectual legacy did not vanish entirely with the execution of leaders such as Grand Master Jacques de Molay. Instead, it persisted in hidden repositories, oral traditions, and secretive circles, awaiting a future capable of understanding and preserving its wisdom. The persecution also intensified the symbolic role of women as guardians of the sacred feminine within the order. With male leadership compromised, women became primary custodians of knowledge associated with Mary Magdalene, the Cathar traditions, and other esoteric currents that had influenced Templar spirituality. They ensured continuity not only of texts and relics, but of the philosophical principles that had guided the order: balance, moral discernment, spiritual insight, and the subtle integration of feminine wisdom into an otherwise male-dominated institution. In this sense, the trials of 1307 did not extinguish the Templars' spiritual mission. Rather, they shifted its guardianship into the hands of those who could operate quietly, resiliently, and with profound discretion. Remarkably, these women did more than simply preserve knowledge. They adapted it to new contexts. As Europe entered a period of upheaval, They embedded Templar teachings into allied religious movements, secret societies, and noble households, ensuring that the intellectual and spiritual principles of the order survived beyond the constraints of geography and persecution. Manuscripts were copied, relics relocated, and codes transmitted through generations, often disguised as devotional or philosophical writings. In effect, they created a hidden lineage, a living memory of the Templars' wisdom that could outlast the execution of leaders, the confiscation of property, and the disbanding of the order. Historical traces suggest that some women may have acted as teachers to the next generation of secret initiates, guiding them in rituals, codes, and esoteric knowledge. Their instruction emphasized not only practical skills in secrecy and survival, but also a spiritual understanding of the sacred feminine and the ethical responsibilities associated with hidden wisdom. By transmitting knowledge through mentorship rather than formal structures, they ensured the order's legacy remained dynamic, adaptable, and capable of integration into new contexts. This invisible mentorship was critical. Without it, the knowledge preserved in manuscripts, relics, and coded symbols would have risked becoming incomprehensible or lost entirely. Even today, the survival of Templar-related knowledge owes much to these women. The myths, legends, and esoteric traditions that continue to captivate historians, scholars, and seekers often bear subtle traces of their influence. Whether in the careful preservation of sacred relics, the protection of coded manuscripts, or the mentorship of initiates, women acted as the silent lifeline of the order, ensuring that its secrets endured even in the face of systemic eradication. Their courage, intelligence, and foresight allowed the Templars' spiritual and esoteric legacies to transcend the catastrophic events of 1307 and continue to resonate centuries later. In the shadow of persecution, women became the invisible architects of continuity, shaping a legacy that would outlast the fall of kings, the execution of knights, and the suppression of orthodoxy. They preserved what was most vital about the Templars, not the castles, not the banners, not even the wealth, but the knowledge, wisdom, and spiritual insight that had guided the order since its earliest days. By doing so, they ensured that the story of the Templars could continue, hidden, secretive, and profoundly influenced by the women whose names history has largely forgotten. After the catastrophic dismantling of the Templar Order in the early 14th century, whispers of survival and secret legacies persisted, giving rise to legends of hidden lineages and descendants who carried the Order's knowledge forward in secret. While most knights were executed or imprisoned, and commanderies confiscated, the Order's influence did not vanish entirely. Women, in particular, played a decisive role in this hidden continuity, acting as custodians of bloodlines, sacred knowledge, and esoteric teachings that might otherwise have been lost to history. Through careful preservation, mentorship, and strategic alliances, they ensured that the Templars' spiritual and mystical heritage endured, quietly threading its way into subsequent centuries. The notion of hidden Templar descendants is often intertwined with stories of noble families across Europe, especially in France, Spain, and the British Isles. Women, particularly those of noble or influential lineage, were instrumental in safeguarding these connections. Some legends suggest that certain families maintained secret genealogies, carefully recording marriages, births, and alliances to preserve the continuity of Templar bloodlines. Women were the gatekeepers of this knowledge, transmitting it through oral instruction, coded manuscripts, or symbols embedded in family heraldry. In doing so, they ensured that descendants not only survived politically and socially, but also remained aware of their spiritual and esoteric heritage. These hidden lineages were more than mere family records. They carried encoded knowledge, ritual practice, and philosophical insight. Women acted as mentors to the next generation, instructing young heirs in the significance of sacred symbols, the interpretation of coded texts, and the responsibilities associated with their Templar inheritance. This was not merely historical or genealogical education. It was an initiation into a secret tradition that blended spirituality, morality, and mystical practice. Through these teachings, the descendants were equipped to carry forward the Templars' esoteric mission, often without the world ever recognizing their role. The preservation of sacred knowledge was particularly critical in the context of the Renaissance, a period marked by intellectual flourishing but also religious scrutiny. Women facilitated the integration of Templar teachings into emerging mystical, philosophical, and alchemical traditions, ensuring that esoteric wisdom continued to influence European thought. They worked discreetly, often guiding scholars, clerics, or artisans in understanding symbolic patterns, sacred geometry, and the ethical frameworks embedded in Templar philosophy. In essence, women acted as invisible transmitters, linking the medieval order with a broader spiritual and intellectual renaissance that extended across the continent. In addition to spiritual instruction, women were often the keepers of physical relics and treasures that carried symbolic or mystical significance. These artifacts, chalices, manuscripts, amulets, and ritual objects, were preserved in private estates, convents, or hidden vaults, often under the meticulous supervision of female custodians. The guardianship of these objects was not merely ceremonial. It was deeply strategic. By protecting them from confiscation or destruction, women ensured that the symbolic and practical power of the Templar legacy could endure. Relics served as conduits of memory, authority, and spiritual inspiration, binding generations of descendants to a tradition that was deliberately kept hidden for public view. The interweaving of bloodline, knowledge, and spiritual practice created a form of legacy that was resilient and adaptable. Women's stewardship allowed Templar traditions to survive not as a formal organization, but as a living network of influence. This network could adapt to political upheavals, religious scrutiny, and social change, ensuring continuity across centuries. In many ways, women were the architects of this hidden infrastructure, connecting distant families, maintaining coded records, and orchestrating the discreet transmission of esoteric wisdom. Their role underscores a profound truth. The survival of the Templar legacy depended not only on male knights, but on the intelligence, foresight, and dedication of women who operated in the shadows. Some legends even suggest that these hidden lineages played a role in the preservation of the sacred feminine within the Templar tradition. Knowledge associated with Mary Magdalene, the Cathar teachings, and other esoteric currents was transmitted alongside genealogical records, ensuring that descendants carried not only blood, but also spiritual insight. Women, as custodians of this dual heritage, ensured that ethical, mystical, and symbolic dimensions of the order were integrated into family traditions. This preserved a balance between visible authority and hidden wisdom, allowing Templar descendants to navigate the shifting religious and political landscapes of the late medieval and early modern eras. The survival of these hidden lineages also contributed to the mythos surrounding the Holy Grail, the sacred bloodline, and the esoteric mysteries associated with the Templars. Women played a critical role in safeguarding narratives, codifying symbolic meanings, and guiding descendants in understanding the deeper spiritual significance of their inheritance. Through ritual, storytelling, and careful mentorship, they ensured that the knowledge carried symbolic resonance that could influence culture, spirituality, and even political structures for generations. In this way, the Templars' influence extended far beyond the medieval period, threaded through hidden family networks guided by female guardians. By the Renaissance, the Templars had ceased to exist as a formal military order, yet their spiritual and esoteric presence endured, largely because of the women who maintained secret networks and familial legacies. Their work ensured that the order's teachings, moral frameworks, and mystical practices were not lost to history. They acted as teachers, archivists, ritual leaders, and guardians of continuity, linking the medieval world with an emerging age of knowledge and intellectual inquiry. In doing so, they bridged centuries of secrecy and upheaval, creating a living memory of an order that had officially vanished but spiritually endured. The story of Templar descendants and hidden lineages reminds us that history is often written through the lens of the visible, the documented, and the male-dominated. Yet the true continuity of knowledge, power, and influence frequently depends on those who work unseen. Women, in preserving bloodlines, esoteric teachings, and sacred objects, ensured that the Templar legacy survived in ways that would outlast castles, battles, and public decrees. Their invisible labor, intelligence, and courage allowed the Order's mysteries to continue influencing Europe for centuries, quietly shaping spiritual and intellectual currents that would later blossom into new forms of mystical and philosophical inquiry. Through the preservation of hidden lineages, women safeguarded not just blood but wisdom, not just inheritance but insight. They maintained a living connection to the Templars' esoteric heritage, ensuring that the Order's influence did not vanish but transformed, passed along through generations, equipped to carry both the visible and invisible legacies of a once great order. In this way, they became the silent architects of survival, the hidden threads that bound past and future, preserving an esoteric flame that history alone cannot fully extinguish. Among the most enigmatic aspects of the Templar legacy are the prophecies and mystical visions that emerged both during the Order's heyday and in the centuries that followed its suppression. These predictions, often apocalyptic in tone, speak of great upheavals, divine justice, and hidden knowledge preserved for future generations. While the knights themselves are often portrayed as the primary interpreters of these visions, there is compelling evidence that women played a vital role in understanding, safeguarding, and transmitting the prophetic tradition. Acting as both custodians and interpreters, they bridged the gap between mystical insight and practical application, ensuring that the messages were preserved without distortion or loss. Many of the prophecies associated with the Templars were written in coded language or allegorical verse, reflecting a need for secrecy in a time of persecution. References to celestial events, hidden relics, and divine judgment are layered with symbolism that only the initiated could decipher. Women, especially those well-versed in esoteric traditions, played a central role in this process. They acted as translators of mystical language, guiding knights and initiates in understanding the meaning of visions, interpreting symbols, and applying the lessons contained within prophecies to the practical realities of the Order's operations. In doing so, they ensured that the Order's mystical insights remained coherent, accessible to those prepared to receive them, and protected from the misunderstanding that could arise from political or ecclesiastical scrutiny. Some prophecies connected the Templars to the sacred feminine, suggesting that wisdom, insight, and divine guidance could flow through women as much as through men. References to Mary Magdalene, the Virgin, and other archetypal figures appear repeatedly in mystical texts, often in conjunction with cryptic guidance for the future of the Order and its knowledge. Women were uniquely positioned to interpret these figures, understanding the spiritual symbolism embedded in rituals, manuscripts, and coded relics. By mediating the connection between prophecy and practice, they acted as living conduits of a mystical tradition that transcended conventional gender roles, integrating the feminine into the Templars' spiritual and strategic framework. Historical accounts and esoteric research suggest that some prophecies predicted the downfall of the Order long before 1307. These visions, preserved in manuscripts and oral tradition, may have informed strategic decisions, guiding the placement of relics, the movement of manuscripts, or the safeguarding of knowledge in anticipation of persecution. Women, entrusted with these instructions, acted as guardians of foresight, ensuring that critical elements of the Order's legacy survived when its visible structures were destroyed. Their ability to read, interpret, and implement the guidance of prophecy was a critical component of the Templars' long-term resilience, allowing the Order's spiritual influence to endure even after its formal suppression. The apocalyptic tone of many prophecies also reinforced the notion of moral responsibility, a principle often emphasized by women within Templar circles. They guided initiates and descendants in understanding the ethical and spiritual imperatives embedded in these visions. Far from being passive or decorative, women shaped the interpretation of prophecy, emphasizing lessons about balance, justice, foresight, and the preservation of sacred knowledge. In this way, they ensured that the mystical teachings of the Templars were not abstract or purely speculative but actionable, guiding behavior, strategy, and spiritual development across generations. Some prophecies also contained subtle geographic and symbolic references, hinting at hidden sites, safe havens, or repositories of knowledge. These cryptic instructions required careful preservation and interpretation, tasks often entrusted to women who could act discreetly. Whether overseeing the relocation of sacred artifacts, guiding Templar descendants to secret locations, or encoding knowledge within manuscripts, women functioned as living keys to the fulfillment of prophecy. Without their guardianship, the instructions contained within these mystical visions might have been lost, misunderstood, or misapplied, severing the link between esoteric knowledge and practical preservation. The enduring fascination with Templar prophecy reflects the success of these women in preserving mystical wisdom. Across centuries, tales of apocalyptic visions, sacred bloodlines, and divine secrets have captivated seekers, scholars, and mystics. While much of this knowledge remained hidden or fragmentary, the continuity of prophetic traditions attests to the careful stewardship of women who navigated danger, secrecy, and political turbulence to ensure the survival of sacred insights. Their role was not passive. It was active, deliberate, and essential to the Templars' spiritual legacy. In some cases, women may have also served as advisors in the interpretation of celestial events, using astronomy, astrology, and sacred geometry to provide context for visions and prophecies. Alignments of planets, eclipses, or seasonal cycles were interpreted alongside mystical texts, revealing layers of meaning that could influence strategy, ritual timing, or the movement of sacred objects. By integrating observation with interpretation, women ensured that prophecy was not only preserved as written word but understood as living guidance, shaping decisions and preserving the spiritual coherence of the Order even in periods of extreme danger. The prophetic tradition, therefore, cannot be separated from the hidden networks of women who protected, interpreted, and transmitted it. Their guardianship extended beyond manuscripts and symbols to mentorship, ritual instruction, and the shaping of moral and ethical frameworks that ensured the faithful application of esoteric insight. Through their guidance, prophecies became living instruments, influencing both the survival of knowledge and the cultivation of wisdom across generations. Ultimately, the role of women in Templar prophecy reveals a profound truth about the Order. Its power and resilience depended not only on visible knights, military might, or monastic discipline, but on subtle, unseen networks of wisdom. These women acted as interpreters, custodians, and conduits, ensuring that apocalyptic visions and mystical teachings were preserved, understood, and applied in ways that safeguarded the Order's spiritual and esoteric legacy. Their invisible work allowed prophecy to serve its true purpose as a guiding force, a moral compass, and a spiritual continuity that survived centuries of persecution, secrecy, and upheaval, ensuring that the mysteries of the Templars remained alive in ways that would continue to inspire awe, inquiry, and wonder. Even after the official dissolution of the Templar Order, its influence quietly persisted, woven into the fabric of European secret societies, esoteric traditions, and mystical lineages. This enduring legacy was not maintained by knights alone, for the visible warriors and monks had largely vanished from the historical record. Instead, women continued to serve as the silent architects of continuity, preserving the order's spiritual, philosophical, and strategic wisdom and transmitting it to new generations in subtle, protected ways. Their influence ensured that the Templars' principles did not fade with the closing of castles or the confiscation of treasures, but survived in hidden networks that would quietly shape the intellectual and mystical life of Europe for centuries to come. From the Renaissance onward, elements of Templar knowledge appear to have influenced Freemasonry, Rosicrucian orders, and other esoteric movements. While these organizations often framed themselves as new or distinct, careful study reveals symbolic patterns, ritual structures, and moral philosophies reminiscent of Templar teachings. Women are believed to have played a pivotal role in this transmission, acting as mentors, custodians of sacred texts, and facilitators of initiation rites. Through their guidance, the knowledge of hidden codes, sacred relics, and mystical symbolism was embedded into new esoteric frameworks, ensuring continuity even as the outward form of the order disappeared from public view. One of the most fascinating aspects of this transmission is the integration of Templar ideals with the preservation of the sacred feminine. Where the male knights were visible enforcers of discipline and ritual, women ensured that principles of balance, intuition, and spiritual insight were retained in hidden curricula and teachings. They shaped initiation rites, safeguarded knowledge of symbolic geometry and sacred relics, and provided mentorship that emphasized ethical and spiritual discernment. In essence, women acted as the moral and mystical backbone of these emerging networks, guiding the interpretation of Templar principles in ways that preserved both continuity and relevance across centuries. In addition to their role in transmitting philosophy and ritual, women often served as intermediaries between hidden networks of influence and the broader intellectual culture of Europe. Noble families, convents, and private estates became centers of learning, where manuscripts were copied, symbols interpreted, and young initiates trained in the principles of esoteric wisdom. These women operated under the radar, using diplomacy, discretion, and intellectual skill to ensure that Templar knowledge survived political scrutiny, religious orthodoxy, and social upheaval. Their efforts preserved a lineage of insight that would later inform alchemy, mystical philosophy, sacred geometry, and occult traditions, all infused with the subtle authority and guidance of women who had learned the lessons of secrecy and stewardship from the Templars themselves. The survival of this knowledge was often tied to the preservation of sacred texts and relics, which women protected with extraordinary care. Hidden manuscripts, sometimes written in cipher, contained rituals, codes, genealogical records, and mystical teachings that could be interpreted only by those trained under female guidance. Relics, including chalices, icons, and ceremonial objects, were kept safe in private collections, convents, or discreet vaults. The women responsible for these treasures acted as both guardians and educators, ensuring that the object's spiritual significance was preserved alongside their physical security. Without their vigilance, much of the order's esoteric heritage might have been irretrievably lost. The interplay between secrecy and mentorship is particularly evident in the role women played in training the next generation of initiates. They instructed not only in ritual practice, but in the interpretation of symbols, the ethical responsibilities associated with secret knowledge, and the careful navigation of social and political dangers. In doing so, they created resilient networks capable of sustaining esoteric traditions even in hostile environments. Their work ensured that the order's wisdom was dynamic rather than static, adaptable to changing circumstances while maintaining the core principles of balance, discernment, and spiritual insight. Women also played a crucial role in linking Templar legacies to the broader currents of European intellectual and spiritual history. Their stewardship of manuscripts, codes, and rituals provided a bridge between medieval esoteric thought and the philosophical and mystical movements of the Renaissance, Baroque, and even Enlightenment periods. By guiding the interpretation of symbols, the transmission of moral principles, and the understanding of sacred geometry, they enabled Templar knowledge to permeate layers of European culture in ways that would remain largely hidden from the official historical record. The order's influence endured not through military might, but through the quiet, persistent work of women ensuring that knowledge, ritual, and spiritual insight continued to shape European thought. Remarkably, these networks of women were not limited to a single region or culture. Evidence suggests that they operated across borders, coordinating the preservation of manuscripts, relics, and mystical teachings between France, Italy, Spain, and even the British Isles. This transnational network allowed esoteric knowledge to survive periods of persecution, political upheaval, and social change. Women acted as custodians, communicators, and interpreters, ensuring that despite centuries of suppression and transformation, the principles of the Templar Order continued to influence the spiritual, intellectual, and mystical life of Europe. The role of women in these networks also highlights the adaptability of Templar teachings. Where knights had once enforced discipline and secrecy, women introduced subtlety, discretion, and moral nuance. They emphasized the ethical and spiritual dimensions of the Order's legacy, ensuring that knowledge of sacred objects, rituals, and coded texts was used to cultivate wisdom rather than mere power. In this way, the Templars' hidden teachings became more than a relic of medieval history. They evolved into a living tradition, sustained by female agency, mentorship, and stewardship across centuries. Ultimately, the enduring influence of the Templars on later secret societies, esoteric traditions, and mystical currents cannot be fully understood without acknowledging the central role of women. They preserved knowledge, transmitted teachings, safeguarded relics, and guided new generations of initiates, acting as the invisible threads that connected past and present. Their work ensured that the Order's spiritual, philosophical, and esoteric legacy survived long after the dissolution of its visible structures, continuing to shape hidden networks of wisdom that quietly permeate European history, thought, and mystical practice to this day. Through these hidden networks, women ensured that the Templars' legacy was not confined to the pages of history, but lived on as a source of spiritual insight, philosophical inquiry, and esoteric guidance. They became the silent architects of continuity, preserving a tradition of secrecy, knowledge, and mystical understanding that would survive persecution, political change, and centuries of obscurity. In doing so, they remind us that the true power of the Templar Order extended far beyond swords, castles, and banners. It lay in the careful, enduring stewardship of knowledge and wisdom, much of it entrusted to the unseen hands of women. The story of the Knights Templar is not just one of power, persecution, and mystery. It is also the story of a silence, an immense, deliberate quieting of voices that once sang of balance, wisdom, and the sacred feminine. The chronicles of medieval Europe tell us of kings and popes, of knights and battles, of treasure and betrayal. But they rarely tell us of the women. They do not speak of the patrons who funded, inspired, and often sheltered the order. They do not mention the scholars and healers whose teachings shaped the spiritual codes of the Templar Knights. And they do not whisper of the secret initiates, those whose knowledge of the divine feminine once guided the Templars' mystical path. For centuries, history has been written by the victors, and in this case, by the patriarchal hands of church and empire. When the Templars fell in 1307, the world witnessed not only the end of a brotherhood, but the erasure of an entire spiritual balance that once honored both masculine and feminine principles. The Vatican scribes redefined holiness as male, warlike, and obedient. The records of the women who corresponded with Templar leaders, who preserved their relics, who carried on their rites in secret, were systematically burned, buried, or rewritten. Even the term heretic, once used to describe seekers of hidden wisdom, became a death sentence for those who dared remember the old truths. In the aftermath of the trials, silence descended over Europe. Yet in that silence, fragments survived. Hidden in monastic vaults and private archives, a few letters written in careful Latin remain, signed not by warriors, but by women of rank and mystery. Some wrote from convents, others from exile. Their words speak of the light that endures and the lady of wisdom who walks unseen. They write of loyalty not only to the temple, but to an ideal that transcends it, the marriage of heaven and earth through divine balance. To read these words today is to hear echoes of the feminine voice that refused to die, even as history tried to forget her. As the centuries rolled forward, new chroniclers emerged. 19th century scholars and esoteric researchers, poring over old seals and manuscripts, began noticing irregularities. Some Templar documents bore strange marks, interlocking circles, roses entwined with swords, or depictions of crowned woman holding a grail. These were not the usual Christian symbols sanctioned by the Church. They hinted at something older, a devotion hidden beneath orthodoxy, waiting to be seen. For these researchers, it became clear that the Templar myth was incomplete. There was a missing half of the story, a shadow that belonged to women who had been written out of time. This erasure was not accidental. It was strategic. To maintain authority, medieval institutions needed to separate spiritual power from feminine wisdom. The sacred feminine threatened the hierarchy. She represented intuition over dogma, healing over control, compassion over conquest. In silencing her, the Church maintained order, but it also severed a vital thread in the human understanding of divinity. The Templars, who had once walked between these worlds, became victims of the same imbalance. When they were destroyed, so too was the visible lineage of the feminine within Christianity. Only fragments remained, coded into legends, symbols, and whispers carried through secret societies that would rise centuries later. Yet the truth has a way of returning. Modern researchers have begun to reevaluate the medieval archives with fresh eyes. Art historians trace the geometry of cathedrals and discover that many of their designs form the shape of the vesica piscis, the ancient symbol of the womb, the source of life. In these sacred spaces, light itself becomes a feminine metaphor, filtered through stained glass, softened, made nurturing rather than blinding. In the very architecture the Templars helped inspire, the memory of the feminine principle was hidden in plain sight. Others have turned to language. The poetic codes of the troubadours, the songs of courtly love, the allegories of the Grail romances, all speak in layered meaning. The lady so often praised in their verses is not merely a mortal woman, but the embodiment of divine wisdom. The Grail itself, in some interpretations, is her symbol, the chalice of creation, the vessel of life. When history silenced the women of the temple, their message retreated into art, music, and myth, waiting for those who could still hear the old language of symbols. It is in these remnants that their presence lingers. In the legends of the Black Madonna, in the mystery of Mary Magdalene, in the resilience of the goddess archetype that never truly vanished, we sense their quiet defiance. Every image of the mother and child, every whispered story of hidden queens and healers, is part of that continuity. The women of the temple were not erased entirely. They were transformed into myth, into code, into the collective unconscious that humanity carries forward. And yet, this silence still costs us. To forget half of wisdom is to live in imbalance. The suppression of the feminine voice in history has shaped not only religion, but society itself, encouraging conquest over harmony, hierarchy over connection. The Templars' reverence for balance, a union of warrior and mystic, male and female, earth and spirit, was a vision far ahead of its time. Perhaps that was why it had to be hidden. In a world that feared the feminine, such unity could only survive in secret. Today, as historians and spiritual seekers revisit the past, the silence begins to break. The women behind the Templar legacy are slowly re-emerging, their stories reconstructed from fragments and intuition. They are no longer ghosts in the margins of chronicles, but voices reclaiming their place in the narrative of humanity's spiritual evolution. Each discovery, each recovered artifact, becomes an act of remembrance. The great silence that followed the fall of the temple was not an end. It was an interval, a long breath between words. Now, centuries later, the next sentence begins. The story continues not in dusty archives, but in the awakening of those who sensed that the greatest secret of the Templars was never their treasure, but their understanding of balance. The divine feminine was not lost. She was waiting for us to listen again, to see the whole pattern, to remember what was once taken from the light. Beneath the silent ruins of old Templar strongholds, a quiet truth endures. The story of the Knights Templar was never only about power, relics, or lost gold. It was about balance, the sacred union of the divine, masculine, and feminine. For centuries, that feminine force was silenced, her name erased, her symbols buried in stone and scripture. Yet even now, her presence stirs again. In our modern age, she returns not through dogma, but through remembrance. The lady, once hidden behind myth and secrecy, reveals herself in new forms. Through the rediscovery of Mary Magdalene, the Black Madonnas, the sacred geometry of cathedrals, and the growing awareness of divine balance in all things. Her voice speaks through art, through intuition, through the quiet revival of wisdom long forgotten. The true treasure of the Templars was never material. It was understanding. A truth that creation is born of harmony, not conquest, of love, not domination. The hidden women of the temple carried that wisdom through darkness so it could bloom again in light. Tonight, as we listen to their story, we hear not an ending, but a return. The lady walks once more beneath the moonlight of forgotten chapels, whispering the same eternal secret. She was never lost, only waiting to be remembered.